Chairman, just a short while ago, the Honourable Mary-Ann Street gave the Minister, Nick Smith, a lesson in history and in honesty, because the Minister, in what he thinks is an attack on the Labor Party, really gave us more sound and fury than a substitute for real policy. You see, some of us remember the Minister's track record in this last government, and the government we're in now. First of all, he became the Minister of ACC. He said there was a crisis. He cut the funding for women who'd been sexually abused, and so that women did not get the services they need.
Come on.
No, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Honourable Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, those claims are incorrect, but more importantly, they're outside the scope of the part that we're discussing, which is part 1 of the Housing Accords and Special Housing Areas Bill.
If you had been listening to the debate, the first contribution to
order.
No,
I take exception to the way in which the member started that.
Right.
I'll give the member another opportunity.
Mr. Speaker, earlier in the debate, in the first call that the Minister took, he made a very wide-ranging contribution around the previous government's role in housing, what the previous government had done. It was way outside this bill. He was not called up on that, and I'm just setting the scene for this Minister having taken over housing in this government.
Speaking to the point of order.
I'll hear the member.
Mr. Chairman, my comments were directly in response to the claims of the very first speaker in the part, and were entirely on housing. They were about the history of housing and why this bill was needed. I never strayed in my contribution away from the core issues and the purpose for part 1.
Yeah, look, I understand what the member is attempting to do, but this debate should be confined to issues of housing and in relation to this bill. Honourable Annette King.
Speaker, just speaking to that.
No, I've made the ruling now.
Yeah, well, Mr. Speaker, normally you have about 30 seconds to be able to set the scene, and I'd had 10, and so I'd just like I'd like to say to the Minister that his history that he gave of housing and what had gone before is totally wrong, and he misused facts. He gave up-to-date facts, he said, of the increase in the cost of housing under Labor, and then forgot to mention that the cost of housing under National in Auckland alone have gone up by 30%. The cost of housing under National in Christchurch have gone up by 25%. And I think it's important to get on record that he was wrong about what legislation. He said no legislation had been passed by Labor when they were in government, and Mary-Ann Street set out the legislation that had been passed, including a clause that put aside 10% for affordable housing. He said nothing had been done by Labor. In fact, we brought in the Welcome Home Loan, and funding for the Welcome Home Loan was cut in the budget this year. We also brought in shared equity scheme, which has been cut by this national government. So let's put on record that the Labor Party in government did a lot about housing, because one of the things we understood was there was a need for more housing in New Zealand. Now we have had 5 years of a national government, and do you know, until very recently, we were told over and over and over again there was no crisis in housing. Bill English stood in this House and told New Zealand there was no crisis in housing because of low interest rates, which meant New Zealanders were getting into affordable housing. He couldn't be further from the truth. There may well be low interest rates, and it's certainly very beneficial for those who own their own homes, who see their interest rates drop and their ability to pay off their houses faster, but it's done nothing, absolutely nothing, for first home owners. And the unfortunate thing about this bill is it does nothing for first home owners wanting to buy an affordable house. His housing accord, look, I have no problem with his housing accord. I don't have a problem with these special housing zones. They sound very sensible. But unfortunately, it doesn't follow through and produces the outcome that he wants. In fact, he only addresses 2 factors out of the many factors that go to the heart of housing. He picks out the crisis of supply of land, and I say to the Minister, how does this bill release land that is locked up land owned by the private developer?
Because it removes the
How does it make them put land out for affordable houses to be built on?
It removes the MUL.
Doesn't make them do anything but hold on to it till they can get the best possible price. There's nothing in this bill that says to those that are land banking land in the hope that they can get an even bigger price for their land, that they will then say, oh, that sounds like a great idea, let's get it at a cheaper price. I mean, the Minister is kidding New Zealanders in saying that this bill does that. That is not true. He also says planning regulations. Well, of course we need to streamline planning regulations, but they're not going to build a single house unless you address some of the other factors, which this Minister has failed to do. The lack of scale in the building industry, the lack of competition in the supply of building materials, the uncertain access to capital. Where in this bill and where in the government's policy do they help in terms of access to capital? After all, for first home buyers, for those who want to own their first home, they've just had the tightening of access to finance for them. They're going to have less access. Who's, Mr Chairman? Mr Chairman, who's saying that? Mr Chairman?
I've given the call, and Honourable Annie.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. So it's not just the opposition that's saying that. Bankers, commentators, those who are professionals, saying there is less access for people who want to buy their own home. Then the Minister said in his contribution that there were those who are saying that it's draconian. Well, Minister, did you read what the Regulations Review Committee? Now, this is a committee of Parliament, and this is a committee, I believe, has a majority of national members on it. Unusual, because usually it has equal numbers of members on the Regulation Review Committee. But in this case, it actually has a majority of the National Party on it. What did they say about this bill? They said, first of all, there's only been 2 weeks for public submissions on this bill. That is a very fast time to hear submissions on any bill. In addition, they raised concerns about it containing excessive regulation-making powers, which reflects a poor legislative approach. Now, Minister, that isn't any old person saying it's draconian. That is the words of the Regulations Review Committee. Are they credible or aren't they? As I've pointed out, the majority on this committee are the National Party members. So I say to the Minister that this bill is too little, it's too late, and it's around self-serving for political gain. Because for 5 years, this government, if they really cared about affordable housing, would have done something about it. They would have brought in measures. To give him credit, it wasn't until this Minister came in that we actually saw some action. And as nice as Phil Heatley is, he was unable to make any traction. However, Minister, your idea of affordable housing can be seen at Hobsonville. That was an area of government land where you could have had the land at affordable cost. And in the program for Hobsonville, the housing accord wouldn't have even been needed. You wouldn't have to have a special housing zone, as you have in this bill. You could have built affordable housing. Now, do you know the size of the so-called affordable housing being built at Hobsonville? 60 square metres up to 80 square metres. In other words, a shoebox. In other words, it's not affordable housing for a family. And does the Minister know how few houses are being built? And it's a token gesture to affordable housing. He's shaking his head. Those are the facts, Minister. You talk about land being released. If the government wanted to release land in Auckland, for example, they could do that tomorrow. Because who owns most of the land that could be used in Auckland? The government. and you don't need a housing accord. You don't need to have a special housing zone. You can release land. You can release government land, and you can do it at an affordable cost. You could look at a range of ways of doing it. You could look at shared equity. You could look at whether the land is actually owned or not. Of course there are treaty claims, and we've had that on many, many occasions, Mr Williamson. But we got through it at Hobsonville, didn't we? We've got through it in other areas. Look, the truth is, you don't actually need an accord. You actually don't need a special housing zone if the government seriously wants to address these issues. So there's been 5 long years, no progress made, and nationally only 5% of new residential construction is affordable. This bill will not give us one more affordable home. So the only conclusion that you can make to those who are listening is that is not the aim of this bill at all. That is not the aim. You can certainly build very big houses. You can build ones with en-suites and many bedrooms, and they cost between $800,000 and $1 million. You can build those. People are buying them. But this will not provide a single affordable home to New Zealanders. Of course, he said, name how many. Tell us once and for all, because this has been asked in this Parliament week after week, how many affordable homes will be built in, I don't want to hear this, thousands, heaps. This is what the minister's saying. This is our minister paid the salary, saying heaps and thousands. Tell us how many houses that are affordable will be built from this bill.
President Sam Lodowenga.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's an honour to speak.